Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries RPG podcast with John and Hannah.
Hi.
And today we're going to be talking about save or die mechanics. Okay, so the idea for today's episode came from one of DBJ's live streams that I was watching today. If you want to get some great RPG ideas, DBJ does live streams pretty much every day, and I'll put a link down to the episode that I'm talking about in the description. So, first of all, what do we mean by save or die mechanics? Well, to my mind, it's a mechanic that either goes around or ignores the normal sort of hit point or wounding mechanics of your game. Essentially, you get one roll. If you fail it, you're dead. That's it. So where do we find save or die mechanics? I'm mainly going to be referring to sort of D&D-esque games in this. Well, I'm most often aware of these mechanics when it comes to traps, although I'm sure they do appear elsewhere. For example, there's like the Medusa's Gaze attack, which petrifies you. You get a save and effectively you're dead.
Poisons.
Yeah, exactly. And like I say, traps do tend to involve poisons. And to give a good example of that, in Old School Essentials, which is my OSR game of choice, there's a section on designing a dungeon that gives you some useful tables to randomly sort of populate your dungeons and determine the trappings. When we get to traps, on the example treasure traps table, one of them is the following: sprung needle. A needle coated with poison jabs out. Save versus poison or die. Now, in Old School Essentials, traps only have a 2 in 6 chance of triggering, and you get the save, so it's not quite as cut and dry as it seems. Plus, we know astute players are probably going to check for traps and try and disarm them. However, if you're unlucky, within a couple of dice rolls, you could be dead. Now, that's not so lose some hit points, lose a level, or you're debilitated, you're brown bread. And unless your game has some sort of accessible resurrection style magic, you're pretty much going to stay that way. So, have we got any initial thoughts on save or die mechanics?
It's not something I use at all as far as I can think, unless I've specifically told the player characters, if you do that, you're going to have to make some sort of save versus death.
Yeah, I think for myself, I'm a little bit conflicted about it, to be honest. I get that they're supposed to emphasise, it's like adventuring, particularly in old school D&D, which is where you find a lot of these. It's brutal, it could be unpleasant. Most heroes don't make it to high level, that's why you've only got a few high level heroes.
I think the reason I don't tend to use them is because I don't really like those sort of throwaway characters. And you do need to have a lot of throwaway characters for a game with a lot of save or die mechanics.
Yeah. To
actually run as a game, you cannot get attached to your characters.
Yeah, I think for me as well, one of the sort of, and I'm going to present downsides and upsides to it. One of the things for me is that I understand why they might be sort of part of old school games and they're part of that old school vibe, but to me, it's just not a very interesting death. Now, don't get me wrong, I get that all deaths aren't going to be glorious last battles against overwhelming gods, falling beneath 100 orc blades as you're screaming your defiance at the Dark Lord or whatever. But just a roll or two and sorry, the dark's poisoned you, you're dead, roll another character, isn't particularly interesting. Also, I can appreciate that, in games where resurrection magic's maybe a bit more available, the edge gets taken off them a little. So, yeah, you get killed, it might cost you a load or you have to do a quest or whatever, but you get the person resurrected or reincarnated. But since I don't use those magics in my game, in the games I run, when you're dead, that's it. I'm probably a little more hesitant when it comes to save or die mechanics because that's literally it.
Well, yeah, and I expect that's part of why you don't use the save or die, because you don't like the resurrection magic.
Yeah.
Because that's an out for too many other things as well.
Yes, it is, yeah. Okay, so let's have a quick look at the potential like good points of save or die mechanics. So first of all, we've touched on it a little bit, but I'm going to throw in there that it reinforces this like brutish and often unfair lifestyle that adventurers subject themselves to in return for that promise of wealth, power, or whatever motivates them to become an adventurer. And as we said earlier, there's a reason there's not like a million like level 20 wizards knocking around in like most campaign worlds, except for the Forgotten Realms. And I think part of the reason for that is being an adventurer, that's a dangerous thing. So whilst there's probably loads of level 1 adventurers, I think there's probably maybe, and I'm just pulling figures out of my backside here, probably maybe half of them get to level 2, then half of them get to level 3, until you get to the higher levels, and there's only like 1 or 2 people who make it to those higher levels. So I think it reinforces that, and it makes sense within the sort of like the metrics for the, certainly for a D&D style world. I think it also lets your players know that even if your character's like a Billy Badass with like hundreds of hit points, there are some attacks, poisons and traps that are just going to drop you regardless of that. So you still have to be a little bit careful when you go into a dungeon, rather than just like swaggering in with all your million hit points, secure in the knowledge that you can probably survive whatever's thrown at you, at least long enough to get out of the dungeon. And hopefully, it'll teach players not to get too precious about their individual characters, since they know they could open a trap chest and boom, that could be it. Now, whether this is a good or a bad thing, as we were talking about earlier, that depends on your group and the type of game you're playing. And it can even vary within the same group, depending on the game. Like if I'm running like a mega dungeon, sort of old school dungeon crawl, you expect people are going to be dying left, right, and centre in a dungeon. Whereas a more sort of, perhaps, I'm not really keen on this term, but like a more sort of story-led game, you might have more invested in the characters, so you might want less of the instant death. I know you said you don't really tend to use them because you don't like these disposable characters.
It's sort of acknowledged in the games that I run that no character is going to die unless the player knows about it in advance.
Yeah.
And usually, unless the player has requested it, characters just don't die in my games. It's very rare that I'll have a reason for a character to get killed unless they've walked into a situation. And again, I would say to them, if you do that, if you open that airlock while you're standing inside it without a spacesuit, you're not going to live for very long. You're going to get this mechanic and then you'll be dead. And people very rarely go for that. But if you were about to open the doors on an airlock, it would go through your mind the fact that you're about to die.
Yes, yeah.
So, yeah.
Now, before we get people being up in arms, being like,
how can you not have death in your games? There's going to be no cost and there's no risk and whatever.
I will point out that Hannah runs games based on Star Trek. And
Absolutely. And there are red shirt characters in these games that are completely fair game to die at any moment. And this has led to quite a lot of sort of interesting character development and stuff. But we also have, like, the main crew are desperately trying to save the red shirts all the time, which I find quite funny.
But yeah, as we've said, like, when you see like the source material, apart from like a very sort of like few sort of plot specific incidences where it's very important, you don't tend to have the main characters die. It's always like Ensign Gunnerbite it or like Ensign Soondead who like just come in their red shirts, and when the Klingons come in and fire off a random disruptor, it's like, oh no, the random ensign we never knew existed before now has been killed. So I think that's very thematically appropriate for that sort of game. Would I go for that sort of approach with like an old school D&D game?
Absolutely not.
No, definitely not. And I think one of the things to bear in mind when we're talking all about this is that all of this is related to the sort of game you're running and the sort of the milieu that you're running it in. So what's appropriate for a story-led Star Trek game isn't going to be the same as what's appropriate for like an old school D&D game by any means. And we're sort of coming at it from slightly different angles because I tend to run the sort of old school D&D style game. Hannah runs the more story-led Trek games.
But even when I do run D&D, it's sort of recognised by the group that I am not going to do something that is going to insta-kill your character.
Yeah.
Because I, as a GM, just don't find that kind of story interesting. If there's something that's going to insta-kill someone, it's going to get one of the NPCs, and it's going to be there for a story point, even if it's just killing off one of your hirelings to remind you that, yeah, this is a very, very dangerous dungeon, and if you go into a combat, if you spring a trap that I've got there, then your character might die. But I wouldn't just insta-kill out of nowhere with a trap or something a main character, a player character rather.
Yeah, and I think you make a very important point there, and it's basically the fact that, like, let's face it, D&D, sort of as it is fairly sort of generic, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that you can run a lot of different types of fantasy, ostensibly using the same rules. So in this case, I prefer like the slightly grimmer, almost like Warhammer Fantasy roleplay style sort of D&D. You know, everything's a bit grimy and like horrible, whereas Hannah prefers like the slightly higher fantasy sort of stuff.
Well, if I'm running games, it's going to be one of three things. It's going to be either a family story that's all sort of human interest, civil rights sort of themes. It's going to be a big ethical dilemma about whether or not two groups should go to war or should do whatever horrible things that's going on in the real world that stresses me out. Or it's going to be a creepy horror dungeon crawl type scenario. And if it's the creepy horror dungeon crawl type scenario, the players are going to know that within the first 5 minutes of the game, and they're going to know that the rules are slightly different to when it's a highbrow sort of drama compared to something that's supposed to be scary and full of horrible things that are going to kill you.
Whereas most of my games are like, the world's gone to darkness is rising. What you got to do about it, sucker? And obviously that's a very broad sort of stroke sort of things. We all try and like vary it a bit, but those are our sort of like key things we do. So even within D&D, we're both running D&D, we have very different approaches to it, and that reflects how more or less likely you're going to use these things. Now, when it comes to, I think the final thing I'll say for like good points when it comes to like save or die mechanics is that it does encourage players to search for traps and to check objects before just opening there. Now, and I'm not saying either approach is necessarily better than the other, they're just different, but if you're playing in a game where you know that like you're not really going to die like instantly, you can like flip open treasure chests left, right and centre, that's fine. At worst you're going to be like, oh, I've taken some weird curse effect, or I've taken some hit points of damage or whatever. Whereas if you're playing a game where you're like, each treasure chest you open, you're like, oh, this could be like the last thing I do with this character. You're going to have a very different approach to opening that. You're going to be tapping it with your 10-foot pole. You're going to be getting the dwarf in to like check the masonry. You're going to be doing whatever. Whereas if you're a bit more you're going to be a bit more laissez-faire with it if you know you can get away with it.
And I think this is where my use of these mechanics comes in, because I have no interest in faffing about opening treasure chests. I'll tell you what, you got.
I'm all about that treasure chest life.
I don't need or want to go through every detail of every coin in the dungeon or every step of every room in the dungeon. I want to do the story. Whereas I know that like if you play it more as a board game in my head, or a war game where it's all about specific movements in the dungeon, who's in what room, how far away people are from stuff, if that's your thing and you enjoy doing it, go for it. And these save or die mechanics can make that sort of game really exciting, but it's just not how I tend to do games.
Yeah, like we said, it's like a matter of like expectations and the sort of game you're running. Okay, so let's move on to potential like downsides or bad points to save or die mechanics. So I'm going to throw one into the ring, and I'm going to say, when it comes down to it, a couple of bad rolls can finish like a player character of almost any level. So whatever story, whatever interesting things were going on with that character, they just come to an end. And if it's like a long-running PC, the player might have got pretty attached to them. And such, just like a quick, like, you're dead, that could be pretty jarring in terms of, like, the progression of the actual session. Now, if this happens at the start of a session or midway through, the player's either got to gen up another PC, and you've got to find a way to bring them in during the session, or they're potentially going to be sitting out the rest of the session. That's assuming they're even ready to, like, jump back in. Because, like I say, it can be quite jarring. If it's a PC you've been playing, like, in real life for, like, 3 or 4 years, you might need, like, to take a little moment and have a think. You might not even consider, what I'm going to play next. You might have to think about that. Now, there are, of course, ways around this, like, or interim solutions. You could have a player take on the role of a henchman or a hireling until the end of the session. Then you can have a discussion about what they're going to play and bring them in the next session. But like I say, depending on the player and how attached they were, they might need a bit of time before they actually are ready to gen up a new character and take on a new role within the game. I find this particularly exaggerated if it takes place at the start of a combat. Now, as we know, D&D combats can run long. Mm-hmm. And if you get taken out at the start of a combat, you might just be sat there twiddling your thumbs for like half an hour, depending on how big the combat is, before you can even start to think about getting back into the game. Mm-hmm. Now, also, because save or die mechanics pretty much bypass the normal hit points, armor class, sort of style system of damage, if you're playing like a version of D&D like 3.5 or like Pathfinder, where, character optimization's more of a thing, then too regular a use of save or die mechanics can make the effort you put into, like, making sure you've got a high hit point character or a high AC character feel just a bit pointless, because that whole system of rules has just been ignored.
Yeah. A lot of this seems to be about finding a balance for when to use these things. And as I say, it's the sort of thing that I would allow if the story sort of required it, but I wouldn't actively put into a game unless a player sort of got themselves in there, or I'd given them a warning.
Yeah,
but then if you start your game using these sort of mechanics early on, and you make it clear that there's going to be a lot of character death in your game when you invite people into the game, go for it, because I can see how having a lot of high character turnover makes the ones that do survive feel even, like, tougher for having survived all this.
Yeah.
And also means that you're focusing on world building rather than character building, if you get what I mean.
Yes, yeah. Now, I think, as you say, it's a matter of viewpoint and a matter of balance. So, I mean, looking at what we were talking about, where it potentially, like, wastes the character optimization, that could be a good or a bad thing. Now, it could be good because it might teach a player, like, not to just, like, stack all their eggs in one basket and rely on, like, oh, I've got the world's best AC, so I'm invincible. But again, it depends on the type of game you're running and your group, as you were saying.
And it strikes me that these are the sort of mechanics that lead to a lot of arguments when people feel like the GM's running the game as if it was GM versus player. And that's not necessarily what is happening, but you can't help but feel when, like, 4 or 5 characters have got killed by random traps or whatever with save or die mechanics, that maybe the GM's just having fun killing characters.
I mean, I think for me as well, I mean, my main sort of gripe with this sort of type of mechanic, and I'm not saying I don't use them, because I do, and we'll talk about how I use them in a little bit. My main gripe with them is, like, because it comes down to just like a single or a couple of rolls, beyond not opening the chest in the first place or being a bit careful, once you've made that decision and the trap's been triggered, you then have no say in it. It's just down to, like, luck, basically. Which, yeah, certain people like that. It's in the lap of the gods. That's absolutely fine. But for me, it's like in my Old School Essentials campaign where Arthur, his character, got killed by a roper. Because that was like a whole combat and an encounter, and eventually they ended up bugging out after his character died, they could have chosen to withdraw at any time. Granted, yeah, okay, a couple of them were, like, wrapped up in tentacles, they had to fight their way out and stuff like that. But it wasn't just a case of, like, the roper's got its tentacles on you, you're insta-dead. They saw they were in danger, they had stuff they could do, and they could try and think their way out of it or fight their way out of it. And that made an interesting scene. Whereas if it had just been a case of tentacles got you, you're dead, that scenario would have been both far more lethal and also less interesting.
There's something that occurs to me as you were saying that.
Yeah.
If you've got these mechanics in your game, you are also giving the players access to these mechanics.
Yeah.
So, because it doesn't have to be a trap. It can be an assassin. It can be...
Yeah, poison.
Poison in your food.
Yeah.
It can be snake biting you as you're walking through a garden.
Yeah.
It could be all manner of different things that lead to a save or die. It could be a meteorite dropping out of the sky. But once it's there in the game, the players then have the chance to use it against their enemies.
Oh, yeah, because you can bet
So-
if there's a poison, the first thing the players will do is like, can we harvest that poison?
Absolutely. So, again, it gives you the chance to take out an enemy that's vastly superior to you in many other ways by just forcing them into a save or die mechanic
Yeah.
of whatever type you like. You could push them off a cliff. You could send an assassin after them with a poison crossbow.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Anything the NPCs can get, the players will try and get their hands on. And to me, that doesn't bother me too much because I think it's worse for the players because, let's face it, if you kill one of my... Let's say we've got some like mad like Duke who's like one of the main antagonists in my game. If I've got a couple of options. You've got your ultimate poison. You stab this Duke. He fails his save. Boom, he's dead. I'm not going to run out of NPCs as a GM. And if I want to, I've got a couple of choices. And I can either be like, all right, okay, yeah, we'll eject that story. The Duke's plan falls apart. He's no longer there. He's dead. And I can move on. There's still stuff going on in the world. It's not the end of the game. Or if I really want that plan to carry on, I'll be like, well, he's got his second in command who just like takes over the reins of power. And like, okay, yeah, maybe you've set them back a bit, but it doesn't completely stop the plan. So there's ways a GM can sort of work through that, and it's not a problem. Whereas as a player, you have the one player character, and once they're dead, you've got to start again with an entirely new player character. You can't just like pick up where your old character left off normally. So I think it's more of a thing for them. So let's move on to how we use save or die mechanics. Now, if I was going to give a glib answer, I'd say carefully, that's how I use them. But in all seriousness, I do use save or die mechanics, as we said earlier, because I run old school games. And in my opinion, the knowledge that you could die from like a poison dart or anything like that, that's part of that old school vibe. However, I don't use them often, and I certainly don't use them all the time. Partly because I don't want to be losing like a dozen or so characters each session. Also because it doesn't make a lot of internal sense as far as I'm concerned in a campaign world. I mean, to use the dart trap as an example, unless you're planning on never going back to your treasure chest, are you really going to risk putting a dart trap on it that's so lethal that, like, if you come back a few years later and you forgot the precise method for unlocking it, or you happen to be a bit clumsy that day, it might stab you and insta-kill you? Are you really going to risk that? Or are you just going to put a better padlock on it? Or are you going to put a puzzle lock on it? Because, you know, wizards love them puzzle locks. Now, with monsters that have, like, a save or die attack, like a Medusa, like, you look at it, petrified and turned to stone. If there were too many of them, they would have depopulated vast swathes of your campaign world. Because they'd have just been roaming around, like, killing stuff left, right and centre with the greatest ease. I mean, if you think these save or die attacks can just, like, take down a lot of an adventurer, what chance has old, like, Farmer Giles got, like, in his cornfields or whatever? None, that's what chance he's got. And since your campaign world hasn't been, like, depopulated to that vast amount, it would stand to reason to me that, like, monsters with that level of attack are pretty rare, or they're, like, confined to a small area. I mean, so take like the classic sort of myth of, like, the Medusa, you know, when, like, Perseus goes to fight Medusa and, like, he confronts her in a lair and the statues spread about of all the people who've come to defeat her. Now, if you think about it, unless Medusa was tied to that lair for some reason, why aren't there, like, vast swathes of Greece where there's, like, no, like, living people? There's just statues everywhere. It doesn't make a great deal of sense. So I try and keep that sort of, like, creature on the down low. Another thing I tend to do is I warn the players if there's a potential for save or die in a session. And now, I know I'm risking my sort of OSR card there, and I know some people are going to be up in arms saying,
Oh, dude, that's weak. Surely the characters wouldn't know, isn't that a bit meta?
and you know what? Yeah, it is, but so what? If it results in a more satisfactory experience for myself and the players, I don't mind that, and it also sets expectations accordingly.
Yeah.
If I say to them at the start, oh, there's a potential for save or die in this session, someone just like blunders straight in, flips that treasure chest open, in goes the dart, I'm like, sorry, you failed your save, you're dead. They can't come back and be like, oh, what, I didn't know, what's going on? Because I'll be like, do you remember at the start of the session when I said like potential for save or die? and I'm covered. That's grand. And to be fair, like I say, I don't mind getting a bit meta if it means we all have a better game, because that's what we're there for at the end of the day. We're all there to have fun. And the last thing I'll say, and the way I tend to use them, is having a system in place to deal with any sudden character deaths that do occur, which I think is very important. Now, in my online game, we have a scheduled break, so normally about halfway through, where we can get drinks, user facilities, etc. It normally lasts from like 10 to 15 minutes. If we've got a character death in the first half of the session, I wrap up the combat or the immediate situation that's going on, and then I pull the break forward. Everyone else can go off, have a drink, whatever. I then stay on the computer during that break, have a chat with the person who's like lost their character, make sure they're all right and they're ready to gen a new character, chat with them about what ideas they've got. We've then got 15 minutes to gen up a new character, and gen up an old school character doesn't take very long. Roll your attributes, pick a class, happy days. So if they're ready to gen a new character, I can assist them during the break. We can talk about how to get them into the game as quickly as possible. As I said, we had this in a recent game where Arfed's character, Brother Lomas, was killed by a roper. We got to the end of that combat, they bugged out, we pulled the break forward, everyone else went and got a break. Nice little break after like a sort of tense combat. I had a bit of a chat with Arfed, he genned up a new character, a barbarian. We were like, right, okay, well, he could fit in the background in this way. Where are the player characters heading next? Are they heading back to the home base? Oh yeah, they met some bandits, and they said, oh, if you ever need a place to like come and stay, you can come to like our village, because they got on with them well. And I was like, oh, maybe your character was one of them bandits. And he was like, oh yeah, and we were like, did a little bit, just a tiny little bit of background for him. We cut to the player characters being back at home, his character like arriving at the village, wanting to take more than his offer, didn't want to be down with the bandit life anymore. Not the most realistic thing ever, but it meant we got him back into the game quickly. We cracked on with the game. Happy days. And it also, that break, gave me an opportunity to like set him up a character sheet on the VTT I was using, throw a quick token together, so we could literally like bounce him straight into the game and we could carry on. So, have you got anything else you'd like to say about save or die mechanics?
Not really, just, as you say, use with caution.
Yeah, I think that will be the main thing to take away from the episode. The suitability of save or die mechanics depends on the type of game you're running and the sort of expectations of yourself and your players. They're not necessarily bad, but they suit certain games more than others. And if you are going to use them, just use them with a little bit of a light touch and don't be too heavy-handed with them. And have a sort of half an idea in your head as to like, if someone does like get insta-killed, what are you going to do afterwards to get them back in the game? So they're not just sat there bored twiddling their thumbs, and you won't go far wrong, really. So, we hope you've enjoyed that episode on Save or Die mechanics. Thanks very much to DBJ and his live stream for inspiring this. Again, there'll be a link to the video in the description below. If you want to get in touch with us, maybe tell us about your favourite Save or Die incident, or give us some advice about how you use them in your game, then you can get in touch with us by leaving us a voicemail using the SpeakPipe website, link in the description below. Or if you're having trouble with that, we still have our old Anchor account available, which you can use to leave us a voicemail. Again, link in the description below. Or you can send us an email to rddrpgpodcast@gmail.com. Until we see you next time, take care, stay safe, and whenever you're playing, have fun. And don't forget to check those chests.
Bye.